thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Giordi Frederick, and I'm a graduate student here at Texas Women's University studying clinical mental health counseling. When I'm done with this degree, I'll be a licensed professional counselor, better known as a therapist, but I'm not here to talk about therapy tonight, though. My background prior to this degree that I'm currently working on is in classical music. My bachelor's degree is in piano performance, and I've been studying and performing music since I was 6 years old. Classical music, where pianos and violins and other instruments play old-fashioned sounding music that's specifically for relaxing to, or for making your baby smarter. This music was written by the greatest musicians to ever live, and anyone trying to follow in their footsteps will ultimately fail just trying to reach their level, except that all of these are just various myths that many of us have learned about classical music, along with a host of other fictions. The term classical music refers to a ridiculously large collection of written music spanning over 400 years, and including everything from large-scale works for full orchestra to songs for solo voice, choral works, large-scale dramas, both operas and not, solo instrumental works for piano and others, and small ensemble works ranging from 2 musicians all the way to a full orchestra. Every imaginable combination. When music from such a large period of time is gathered together and thrown under one term, it's really easy for a lot of misconceptions to form. Many people hear one piece, dislike it, and think that that's what all classical music sounds like. Sure, many of the same instruments were used over the centuries, but the way that a guitar was used in 1920 is very different from the way guitars were mainly used in the 1980s. And that's just a difference of 60 years. Think of the variety present in a category spanning over 400 years. It's staggeringly broad, encompassing every emotion that we experience in our present age, and made even more interesting by the various cultural contexts in which each composer from the past lived. The idea that all these people were geniuses and that that's why their music has survived is a flawed premise. The music we have from the past, in almost every case, has survived because wealthy individuals or institutions either paid to have it written or preserved it as an artifact. Popular culture is also fond of characterizing famous composers like Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven as the rock stars of their day. But in reality, culture is far too complicated and varied to draw that kind of comparison. An appreciation for classical music has often been considered a sign of good taste or good education in Western society, and as such has become associated with class divisions, including lack of access to education, particularly quality arts education. Many people also view so-called classical music as the musical language of cultural oppression, and to a certain extent this is true. Music from composers such as Beethoven and Franz Liszt was used as the soundtrack for the rise of Nazi Germany. The fascists co-opted great music in order to establish themselves as superior, and music can be a powerful tool when used in that way, regardless of the intentions of the composers. In early 20th century America, the Black musical traditions of ragtime, blues, and gospel were combining to form what would eventually become jazz. Jazz eventually led to rock, soul, hip-hop, and practically every other genre of music that we associate with the United States in the 20th century. But all of these new art forms were attacked at the outset, before eventually gaining legitimacy with the majority of the public. They were held up against classical music, which was used as an example, as a gold standard for quality and achievement. It's in no way an apples to apples comparison, though. The mediums of art are so different that any comparison is just laughable, but it's a trope that's been repeated over and over and over again. In 1967, an esteemed Austrian musicologist and music critic named Hans Keller, who worked for the BBC in London, reviewed a new band that was just starting out, named Pink Floyd. He admitted that he found their music repetitive, confusing, too loud, and at one point said, "I may be too much of a musician to appreciate them." The first two statements are very common to any situation where someone from an older generation is confronted by music sufficiently different from what they grew up listening to. But that final statement, "I may be too much of a musician to appreciate them," betrays a certain sort of artistic superiority that is often associated with classical music and training in classical music. This idea that you've reached the ultimate level and so-called common things are now beneath you. This brings us to another of the convoluted issues associated with classical music as a term. Like I mentioned earlier, people are fond of characterizing famous composers as the rock stars of their day. But the problem with that kind of analogy is that popular music, whether it's rock or hip hop or EDM, is written primarily for the middle class, the people who can afford to pay for concert tickets, records, streaming services, and in general participate in a fandom. But this middle class didn't really exist until the 19th century. Public concerts of orchestral music were also rare until the 19th century. And during the preceding 2 centuries, during which instrumental music began to become popular, almost all large-scale courts were given at all large-scale concerts were given at court for the wealthy or for the elite, or at large churches. The people writing the music for such concerts, though, were very rarely from that upper class themselves. Most of the music that we have left from the years pre-1830 was written either for those courts of kings and rulers or for the church. The religious establishment wielded immense power over the artistic community. And given this, the only music that ever got printed or even written down to begin with was usually written for either of these two main powers. The development of the middle class in the 19th century presented a new market, people who could afford to buy sheet music and pay for tickets to concerts. But prior to this existence of the middle class, written music was almost entirely the purview of the wealthy and the elite. This is where the rock star analogy fully falls apart. In many cases, we have no idea what the popular everyday music sounded like from many past cultures. What little was written down has often been lost, and the best examples that can be heard are through the various oral music traditions that survive in some countries, traditions that are passed down through spoken word, not writing. And it should be remembered that even though that even in oral traditions, what survives today is merely a fraction of the variety that once existed. So why should we today in 2023 be interested in music that was written primarily for the wealthy and religious elite? Great question. Here's why. This music was written by humans for humans. For nearly all composers, it was how they put bread on the table for themselves and for their families. These were individuals who woke up every day and struggled with financial problems, family conflict, socioeconomic inequality, and issues of identity as much as we do today. Their struggles were different in that they lived in different times and different cultural contexts, but they lived the human experience, just like we do. And that can be heard in their greatest music, of which there's plenty to explore. But first, we have to rehumanize the composers a little bit. A lot can be gained from reading their letters, of which we have many, especially for the more famous of the composers. In a really famous letter written in 1802, Ludwig van Beethoven was writing to his brothers, struggling about thoughts of suicide and increasingly withdrawing from society due to his worsening deafness. Franz Schubert, who died at the age of 31, due to an, at the time, fatal and untreatable sexually transmitted disease, syphilis, produced an unimaginably vast body of work. In his short 3 decades, writing right up until the week that he succumbed to his illness, in his last 14 weeks of life alone, he produced over 6 hours of music, including some of the best things he ever wrote. So why am I talking about all of this? Because I'm heading towards making the case that this music is above all else beautiful and relatable. The fact that it has been co-opted by powerful and affluent people for often really less than ideal purposes is unfortunate, but it's also something that happens to all art eventually. It's really easy to misrepresent dead artists and to strip them of their humanity and hold them up as an academic and artistic ideal, when in reality they were as flawed and relatable as the rest of us. The term that we use, classical music, can cause a lot of confusion and often obscures the humanity and vulnerability of expression, which is present in all great music, classical and modern. I want to encourage each of you to explore the many different genres within the bucket category that is classical music. Find out what you like. I'm a pianist, so obviously I like piano music, but there's so many varieties. For instance, there's piano with strings, piano with orchestra, piano with winds, and that's just to name a few of the most common combinations. I'm personally a huge fan of string quartets, which is 2 violins, 1 viola, and 1 cello. I'm also a huge fan of the collective works of composers Maurice Ravel, Sergei Rachmaninoff, and Gustav Mahler, just to name a few. But find out what you like. Do you prefer large, full orchestral works like symphonies, or do you prefer smaller ensemble works of 2 to 10 musicians? I invite you to explore, because it's one of the best parts of my life, and I would love to help more people to be able to enjoy it as well. That's one of the saddest parts about this whole greatest music ever written paradigm. It makes people feel like they aren't special or educated enough to understand or appreciate the music. It doesn't take any kind of special training to appreciate it or to discover it, just openness and a desire to explore. So please consider this an invitation. Listen to what you like, both with regards to classical music and non-classical music. There's so much out there, and you don't need special training to discover new things that could end up being incredibly meaningful for you. Thank you.